It was a place that the name meant house of mercy, or some translations it was the house of grace. So, house of mercy, house of grace. This was an ancient pool of Bethesda, was situated near the corner of the old city of Jerusalem by the Sheep Gate. It was told, this pool, to have magical powers, that when the waters of the pool would suddenly begin to bubble, it meant that God had sent an angel down and with his wings had touched the waters, and the waters would start stirring. And legend stated that the very first individual to make it into that pool would be instantaneously healed. And so for decades, the lame, the sick, anyone really, gathered beside it in hope that the healing was real. And they believed that through such an act of moving towards that pool of Bethesda, that God would honor their faith. If people were genuinely healed at these waters of the pool of Bethesda, if there were cases where people were miraculously changed by dipping themselves in the water, it really wasn't unlike God to heal in unusual ways. Scripture tells us stories where some were healed of a purified pot of stew. That's in 2 Kings. There was Naaman, who was healed as he dipped himself in the waters of the Jordan, the filthy waters of the Jordan. There was another individual who was healed simply by touching the bones of Elisha after he had died. And even beyond this story that we're going to look at today, within the book of Acts, some were healed when the shadow of Peter cast upon them. Others were healed as handkerchiefs were brought from Paul and laid upon people for healing, and they were instantaneously healed. And so if God could honor such faith in people, then certainly there was something to being there. God is the God, of course, as we know, of the unexpected. He is the God of the impossible. And he can move and he can act as ever as he determines. And so I want you to imagine a moment, a battleground with wounded bodies that are laying across the landscape, gasping for their last breath. This would be the pool's atmosphere. I want you to imagine for a moment nursing homes that are overcrowded and understaffed, and you see the pool there. Consider the orphans in Bangladesh, or the sex-trafficked children of New Delhi, and you see there what would have been seen as you'd pass by Bethesda, the air filled with waves of groans. The smell of death assaults your nostrils. It's a sea of human need right there. After Jesus returned to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish holy days, inside the city near the Sheep Gate was the pool of Bethesda with 5 covered porches. Crowds of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, lay on the porches. And one of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. 38 years of sickness, day in and day out. Illness, discouragement, ostracized. And for many Jerusalemers, they just simply walked by. They avoided the sight. It was all too foul. It was too apparent of ongoing needs of people that some would rather. I just would rather be ignorant to this section of Jerusalem, but not Jesus. Jesus is in town. That holy day was Passover. He was in town for Passover, and he decided to go and visit this space. And here we see Jesus walking among the suffering, God present among those deeply hurting, the Holy Spirit among those who are devastated in their own spirit from the cause of their life and the situations that they have been forced to endure. And here lays a man, since childhood, had made this place his home. And for 38 years, he had suffered with a debilitating disease that changed the entire trajectory of his life. Day after day, when the waters would bubble, when legend stated that God in his mercy sent his angel down to that pool who would simply dip their wings into the water and the water would begin to bubble up, he was never in all of those years able to make it to the coolness of the pond in time to be healed. Someone always beat him to it. His life had not turned out, really, the way that he probably had dreamt as a young child. Nothing now in this earthly life, of what his life was, seemed worth it. And somehow he found himself clinging to just this last strand of hope that something could change. Something has to change. Have you been there? Are you there now? Things have taken a turn in your life to something you thought would be lasting or permanent. And now, well, I'm just not so sure that's going to be the case. You've struggled, you've wrestled with something that seems forever, and there's no hope that's even tangible for relief in your situation. And whatever stage that you find yourself now, this is not the place you ever dreamt you'd be. Is that you? Or there are those moments when you have a glimmer that, well, things are going to turn around. I just know they're going to change. But for the most part, what is it? It's the same thing, different day, over and over and over again. The ongoing battle. It's fought hour by hour, sometimes moment by moment. And you wonder, where's God in all this pain that I feel? And where has his voice grown silent? And really, you just don't understand anything at the moment. You see, for the ancient people, these were the same thoughts that bombarded them daily when they saw in action. They believed God drew near them because of the mystical bubbling waters, but he didn't seem interested in their daily lives to them. He didn't seem interested in their needs, as the sea of need was knee-deep everywhere you walked there. At least they thought so. These at the pool, they were so self-consumed with their illness, they didn't know, they hadn't even heard about the one, the capital O, one, who was walking in the Judean landscape and bringing hope to so many for the very first time. And so across the sea of human need, Jesus would make his way to the portico and the porches of Bethesda. And here he would pick out one man, and it would begin with a very peculiar question. When Jesus saw him and knew he had been ill for a long time, he asked him, "Would you like to get well?" I've always been struck by this question of Jesus posing, "Do you want to get well?" Of course I want to get well. Why do you think I'm here? I want to get well. I want to find healing. Of course I'm looking for something to change. I'm looking for anything to change. What kind of question is that? Well, it's a practical question. It's a potentially life-changing question. But it also is one that shows the real reality of the secrets of our heart. For this man, you see, if indeed something changed for him, yes, he would be restored back to health, which is what he had dreamed of. I imagine he had prayed for. But it would also mean that he would have to leave all of this that had one time had been familiar now for 38 years and move into a new unknown chapter. His disability, his inability, all would have to be put behind him, which would be great. Imagine, it would be great. But now he would need to make changes as he moved out of this place. See, he couldn't function any longer with an excuse of his illness. Healing always brings change. Always. Yes, it may be a physical healing that enables us to do things that we had never done before. But emotional healing, it's much the same. You see, with emotional healing, when we've been healed in an area, we can't go back to the old ways of our lives that brought all the heartache and devastation to begin with. We cannot go back to that. And in particular, if our struggle is our identity. If we are claiming, if we're one of those people that is, look at my wounds, look at my wounds, look at how horrible my life has been, that's our identity. And so the fresh start of new life requires that of a change of mindset and, yes, a change of our behavior. Over the years, I've witnessed marriages that have been so tumultuous. And one of the mates, they prayed fervently for the other to come in. They just wanted their mate. They wanted their mate to come into this active relationship with Jesus. And miraculously through the years, I had watched this through the years with a couple in particular, changes began to take place. Wonderful. And yet, for the one who prayed, as the mate grew spiritually, they began to withdraw. It was weird. Like, what are you doing? You see, they didn't know how to handle it. A few of these, their identity was that of being the victim of the marriage. And now, the other had set their feet straight. They were pursuing Jesus, and they just literally, they didn't know how to function. And believe it or not, a couple of them, they began to try to self-sabotage the growth. The healing brought change. I've seen those who have struggled with substance abuse, and their identity has been nothing more than, well, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a drug addict. I've heard them saying, nothing is ever going to change. I've heard this. I had rented out a room to a heroin addict. I didn't know that when I rented out the room, but I had a heroin addict that lived in my house for a few years. And he would go into these fits of heavy sorrow because his life was out of control, because all that he was doing and all that he was working was for that next fix. His addiction so comprehensive. But what happened was that when they finally got clean, the fresh new life, the second life, this hope that they had been hoping for all their life was given. They weren't ready to make the other critical changes, like allowing the people that had always been in their lives back into their lives. And in the end, they would fall right back to their old ways and their addiction of what they had once been set free from because of their lack of choices that they made. Healing should bring change. Or let's even get more practical. Let's get personal for a moment. We all have ways and we have things in our character, in our life that we know. We all have these areas we know Jesus isn't pleased with. We know it. We know it. We long to be effective. We do. We really do. And we want to be effective for Him. We want to be used by Him. We want to grow in our spiritual walk. And yet we're still harboring bitterness from some event of the past. Or we're simply negative about absolutely everything. Or we like to stir the pot and watch all the tension take place and then just sit back and watch as it explodes. Kind of ornery. Lean into our ornery side, right? Or maybe, just maybe, We know the things that we're supposed to change. We're aware of where the Holy Spirit has been pressing in on us with it, but, well, it's just the way I am. A flippant response that we give license to ourselves to not follow through with the Spirit's lead. It's just the way I am. So be it. Let the chips fall. Healing should bring change. And in all these scenarios, and of course there's so many others that probably I haven't mentioned, but you know what I'm talking about. Jesus is asking one question. Do you want to get well? Let's just strip it down. Do you really want to get well? Because if we want to get well, folks, change is required. You see, many of us, we simply get comfortable. We're getting comfortable in our struggle. It's become such a part of our life that we don't understand even what genuine freedom would look like. Or more poignantly, how that would change everything about us. I've been going to Celebrate Recovery for the past 4 years. And there are things, you know what? There's a lot of things I'd rather do on a Sunday night. There's a lot of things I would much rather do. But even though I've heard the same teachings for the last 4 years, and even though I went through a step study and dug into a bunch of stuff that I didn't even realize was there, even though I've been given the tools through all of that program to stand strong, what I do know is I need this program to keep my heart on point and my mind where it needs to be, because I'm often willing to wander. I'm prone to wander. I'm prone to leave the God I love because of my selfishness. And so this anchor for me is one of the many anchors of a weekly reminder of just how easily I can fall right back into my old ways, to the things that I'm far more comfortable with. Why? Because, why am I doing this? Because I want to get well. I do. And I want to live well. And I don't want to be comfortable again in all my stupid past and my struggles. And it's ironic, because the freedom Jesus offers and brings, because it's offered requires change as I move forward. The Pool of Bethesda was a waiting room, really, where, let's be honest, they're really not good places to be. If we find ourselves in a waiting room of some form, it's usually because we're about to face some unknown outcome. An emergency has possibly happened. It's usually we're waiting to hear results, or simply a place where answers are to be given, and it's just not ideal. Waiting rooms are not ideal. Waiting rooms aren't meant for us to go and hang out there for long periods of time. And for this one who had longed for such transformation, suddenly the question would put feet to the potential hope of a new reality. Do you want to get well? I can't, sir, the sick man said, for I have no one to put me into the pool when the water bubbles up. Someone else always gets there ahead of me. Notice the first response of this man. It's an excuse. It's not that what he's saying isn't true. I'm sure this is exactly why he's never made it into the waters, due to others pushing him out of the way. But it's worth noting, his first response isn't, yes, please, but it's an excuse. What are the excuses that you've been clinging to lately? Where has Jesus been asking some pretty direct questions of your life and of your mind? and of your behavior. He's just asking some direct question, and he's forthrightly leading our hearts. And yet, what is our response? Are we giving an excuse? Are we making an excuse as to why that we're not going to do what he's doing? Because let me tell you, healing brings change. This man is an interesting case of hope and hopelessness, because he had hope, or he wouldn't be there to begin with. That's why he was there. And yet, well, it really doesn't sound like he really believes any form of healing could take place. He's just there doing the same thing he's always done, expecting different results. They call that insanity. Doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting it to have a different outcome. And in this moment, he does what nearly we all do. We limit God's help by our circumstances or our own ideas and not believe that the one who is asking the question to begin with has the power to actually follow it through. For whatever reason, I mean, it's really strange, out of this sea of need present there, Jesus selects this man. He chose to meet this one man's need. And what's interesting to consider is that here is a multitude of needy people. None of them looked to Jesus as he walked through. One could say that there was almost like a blindness that had come over them at the pool. They were there. There was Christ who could heal them, and not one single one of them sought him out. Their eyes so fixed on the water. That moment when it would begin to bubble, they think, I've got to be in there next. This is where their eyes were. They were so taken up in their own chosen way toward wholeness, their own way that they believed would bring the wholeness, that the true way was neglected. Well, let's talk about that a moment. Are there areas where we're so focused on this or that, what they would bring or could bring us, that we're missing what God's trying to do right here in the meantime in our lives? Are there some of us here who've been saying some of the same things, as if only God would answer this prayer, if only he would do that for me, and possibly that answer is right before us and yet we're not seeing it? Charles Spurgeon developed some of these thoughts. It stated that he pictured this multitude around the waters of the pool of Bethesda, waiting and focused on the water. They were all just looking. He said, I just could see them just all looking at the water, not to Jesus, not to anyone that walked through them. Turning it toward today, Spurgeon said, some are simply waiting for a more convenient time for us to follow him. Others are waiting for dreams and visions to come into play, or signs and wonders, and then I'll know what he's promising. While others are waiting that I just need to feel compelled to do this, or I need to have a heart revival, or I'm waiting for particular feelings that are going to push me to do this. And when these excuses all bombard us, they not only stop us dead in our tracks, they potentially miss what he's trying to do within us. So do you want to get well? This is the question. Healing brings change. And obviously, most sick people, they want to get well, unless they're a hypochondriac. But many times, the discouragement of nothing changes day in and day out, as we know, it wears. It's grinding. It's discouraging. Many times, that discouragement hits so hard. Many times what we long for, the wholeness that we've dreamt of, that we've spoken of, the fulfillment that we would put everything toward, when it doesn't take place, we simply put away any hope of change or any hope of healing. And so Jesus' question cuts to the core of the man It cuts to the core of our own selves now, the excuses that have just flowed and tumbled out of our mouth. That question, do you want to get well? Do you really want to get well? And for this man and for the mission of Jesus today, discouragement withers our hearts. So you see, Jesus is dealing with such a heart as well as this man's inability of his legs. And so Jesus told him, stand up, pick up your mat, walk. And instantly the man was healed, and he rolled up his sleeping mat and began walking. But this miracle happened on the Sabbath, of course. So the Jewish leaders objected, and they said to the man who was cured, you can't work on the Sabbath. The law doesn't allow you to carry your sleeping mat. But he replied, the man who healed me told me, pick up your mat and walk. Well, who said such a thing as that? They demanded. And the man didn't know, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd. But afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and told him, now you are well. Stop sinning, or something even worse may happen to you. Then the man went and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who healed him. Jesus told this man to do something he couldn't do. Being paralyzed, it was impossible for him to rise up and walk. He challenged the man to the very impossible. And that same calling of the impossible is upon us as well. In so many instances and so many stories of Jesus from his word, from our own lives, we know how often that he calls us to do what is not humanly possible without his intervention to work in us. We know that he calls us to do things so many times that are not even part of our personalities, and yet the pressure is on, the Spirit is pressing in, and we're feeling like we have to step out and do where he is moving, and we don't feel that we can. This is what he does all the time. And it's even not what we may have imagined in the first place that we would do. But Jesus calls us many times beyond what our own abilities are or our seeming abilities. I mean, it's not hard to imagine that man's first reaction was much like ours. Would be, I can't do that. Are you kidding me? I can't do that. Why should I even try? But Jesus' presence there somehow prompted him to attempt it. And his presence guided that man towards a response of faith. And the man responded in faith to the impossible and was made well. It's an amazing story. Of course, Jesus did it on the Sabbath, which brought about that wave of controversy again. So let's see. Jesus has healed a demoniac on a Sabbath. He defended the disciples picking grain on the Sabbath. He's healed a man's withered hand on the Sabbath. And let me tell you, there's a lot more yet to come on the Sabbath. He continued to deliberately challenge the legalistic traditions of the scribes and the Pharisees. They had taken the Sabbath, which by design was God's gift to humankind as a day of rest, and transformed that into like a prison of house of regulations and restrictions. And so it's interesting to consider that the Jewish leaders, they didn't even want to know who healed the crippled man at first. They simply wanted to know who told him to carry his bed mat on a Sabbath. His final interaction is telling, as he was concerned, you see, for not just the physical, but for the spiritual health of him as well. Stop sinning, or something worse is going to come across you. A shot across the bow for us, or for the man to take seriously what had happened and what really mattered. It's a shot across the bow for us. Healing brings change, and change is required for growth. our singers would come back up. So have you been waiting at the pool of Bethesda? Have you been pleading with God, with Jesus, for some sort of help, whether it's physical or emotional or it's spiritual? Perhaps many of us here who need healing of some form sit at the side of the pool, but we just don't jump in. We remain high and dry on the side of the healing waters of our spiritual journey. We come up with all kinds of reasons for not seeking healing and such change within our own hearts. The healed, the lame man in the story told his arsenal of excuses to Jesus, and the miracle of this story is that even though the lame man through and behaved in typical self-defeating way, Jesus noticed him and healed him. And he's asking us today, do you want to get well? With all of the things that you're struggling with, do you want to get well? Stand with me. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this story, powerful story of you, Lord. Thank you for this peculiar question that really draws our minds to truth. So I would pray in these moments, Lord, you know what's going on in this room. You know what's going on in our hearts. And more importantly, you know where you're calling us personally. Father, I pray that we seek you and lay to rest some things this morning you've been on us to bring the healing of change